Hello and welcome to Seasons Cast, a Canadian Highlander podcast. We may not be Canadian, but we do hopefully live near enough to Scotland for that to count towards something. I'm your host Tom, better known by friends, allies and enemies as Wilko, and with me is my co-host Aaron, better known by friends, allies and enemies as Aaron.
Hello!
So, as with every episode, we'll be starting off with the card spotlight, where we go through set by set and both pick a card from them that we think is good, but possibly underappreciated in the Canadian Highlander format. Starting us off today is Aaron. Aaron, what card have you got for us today?
Today, from Commander 2017, I have a card called Fractured Identity. It is 3 white and a blue for a sorcery, but reads, Exile target non-land permanent. Each player other than its controller creates a token that is a copy of it. This is just clean removal for basically any form of problematic non-land permanent. But not only does it kind of get rid of the said problem, but also makes it a problem for your opponent by creating it for yourself. You can deal with high-end enchantments, high-end artifacts, high-end creatures. Basically anything that's causing you a bit of bother, and then a very big tempo swing. It is 5 mana and it is sorcery speed, but all in all, it's pretty much a good inclusion if it's the kind of deck where you need that little bit of oomph to just deal with any problem.
Yeah, it's like Council's Judgment's bigger brother. Gets around indestructible for cards like Blightsteel Colossus. And it doesn't even have to hit something as big or impactful as those. It could be a Scavenging Ooze that's causing you graveyard issues. It could be a Ghostly Prison against a prison deck. Could make their Assemble the Legion awkward for them. As you say, it's a nice catch-all that can cause really big tempo swings, but doesn't have to actually be good. It's just a fantastic card that I think is underrated because of its high mana cost and presence in a commander deck, but as we'll see in future episodes, commander decks have given us plenty of good cards, like True Name Nemesis, and although not as powerful as True Name Nemesis, I think it perfectly deserves to go in a lot of blue-white controlling decks.
So that'll wrap us up for talking about Fractured Identity, but that'll lead us nicely into the main subject for today's episode, which is building your first Canadian Highlander deck. Wilko, what's some of the things you consider when you're building a Canadian Highlander deck?
So the first thing I like to think about when building a Canadian Highlander deck is having at least some idea of what I want the deck to be like. It can be a color combination I want to play, an individual card I want to play, a strategy or archetype I want to play. Just having that idea in mind. I'm sure that most people, when building a deck, will already have an idea in mind, but it's just good to get into the habit of thinking about 2, if not all 3 of those things. As an example, say that you really like the card Monastery Mentor. That already means that you're going to be playing a white deck, and then you may want to build a controlling deck, a tokens deck, and so I'd say, so long as you have the idea of like, I want to build Monastery Mentor and say I want to have control, then already that can help fill in the third one of the colors. Already you're probably going to be thinking of something like Jeskai or straight blue-white as opposed to Abzan or Mardu or anything like that. Similarly, if you really want to play Monastery Mentor but want to go more of an aggressive or mid-range route, then the opposite is true. You may want to play Mardu or Abzan rather than Jeskai or straight blue-white or something like that. And then once you have that baseline started, you can start thinking a little bit more about your deck. When it comes to getting past that first hurdle, I think the next immediate hurdle is how you are expecting to win the game, or what you are expecting your game plan to be as the game progresses.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the key things is to remember is whether you want to be asking a lot of the questions, whether you want to be the aggressor, or whether you want to be answering those kind of questions, whether you want to be more reactive, whether you want to be playing more counter spells or board wipes or targeted removal. So if you're going down a more proactive style of deck, you're going to be playing things like Burn or Greater Hoof Behemoth, Elf Ball style decks, where you're going to be playing threat after threat after threat to try and get your opponent down to 0 as quickly as possible. You want the game to be over very quickly. Whilst on the other hand, if you're playing a more reactive deck, think decks like blue-white control, certain mid-range decks, you want the games to go on for much longer than those kind of proactive decks.
Yeah, it's not exactly a black and white scale. Mid-range decks, for example, the clues in the name, they sort of fall in between a little bit, but they do often try to make the game go on a little bit longer than the aggro decks do. Aggro decks, just want to get the game over. If they can do it on turn 2, if they can do it on turn 3, they will try everything they can to do so. Mid-range decks often don't really get going until turn 3, even turn 4. And so obviously the game naturally goes on a little bit longer, whereas control decks are actively looking to make the game go on as long as possible, accrue the advantage, and then, win that way. So when you've sort of worked out where in that sort of spectrum your deck is, you need to think about specific win cons, not just how am I winning, but what cards am I using to win. This is less relevant for aggressive decks where there isn't like specific cards in mind. It's not like your end game is you want to cast exactly Lightning Bolt. It's normally just I want to use enough burn spells, deal enough damage, play enough creatures, etc. to get my opponent to 0. Mid-range decks, sort of similarly, it'll be often I want to play a big bomb or something like that. Sometimes there may be specific cards in mind that you are looking for to sort of take over the game more. In mid-range decks, these are often planeswalkers or maybe a powerful instant or sorcery effect. And then for control decks, it's sort of the opposite thing. Because so much of your deck is based around value and answering your opponent's game plan, you will have fairly limited win conditions. So, for instance, if I was building, let's say, blue-white control, my win conditions would be quite specific cards. An Entreat the Angel off the top, a Chase the Mind Sculptor ultimate. There'll still be a fairly decent list. Again, it might come down to, Snapcaster beat. But, the way that you're aiming to win, your big win conditions will probably be about 4 or 5 cards or 1 or 2 strategies, whether that be, like I say, make tokens with Entreat the Angels or a Planeswalker ultimate. The main strategy that doesn't follow this is combo decks, where often there will be a handful, if that, of specific payoff cards. So, for instance, Storm is a deck that wants to end the game as quickly as possible, but it's not doing that with just any old card. It's doing that specifically with Tendrils of Agony, with Empty the Warrens, cards like that. The Hoof deck that we mentioned earlier, it's called Hoof for a reason. It can end the game by just beating in with little critters, but most of the time what it's aiming to do is put a Crater Hoof Behemoth in play. And the reason that I've talked about this so much is because it's important to focus your deck and not dilute your game plan. You wouldn't see Burn play Inferno Titan, because although that card is very, very powerful and when it hits the board gets your opponent dead very quickly, it's a 6-drop in a deck that is preferably not looking to even get to turn 6. You wouldn't see a blue-red control deck, Blue Moon as it's called in the format, playing Goblin Guide, because again, Goblin Guide isn't a card that gets you advantage or gets you to the long game. Once you work out your strategy and the way that you want to win, you can work out your win cons and work out the best win cons for the strategy that you're going for.
Yeah, it's worth remembering here that Canadian Highlander is a fast format, but you're playing with some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. Can't really afford to take time off to durdle, necessarily. When you've got heavy hitters from other formats, like in Commander, for example, where you've got cards such as Doubling Season. Doubling Season in that format is an exceptionally powerful card, but yet here, taking turn 4, turn 5 off, depending on your board state, to play an enchantment that doesn't immediately impact you, is going to give your opponent an opportunity to then accelerate their game plan. If they're playing an aggro deck, they're just going to blatantly ignore it and push right through. If they're playing against a control deck, they can counter the Doubling Season, you've tapped out for the turn, and now they get to whatever they need to do to really cement their lead. Obviously, that's not saying that cards that enter the battlefield and don't immediately impact the board are bad. When you've got cards like Sylvan Library that come down and don't immediately impact the board, but do set up your future turns. Sylvan Library still sees quite a considerable amount of play in Canadian Highlander. The most crucial difference between Sylvan Library and Doubling Season, however, is the fact that Sylvan Library is 2 mana, whilst Doubling Season is 5. This means that you'll be able to get down your Sylvan Library very quickly, usually on turn 2, times turn 1 if you're very lucky with certain openers, or you can hold it up for later turns on turns 4 or 5 where you can play your Sylvan Library and still either play another threat to the board or hold up a response to something if you're playing a more controlling deck. Whilst with Doubling Season, if you're playing this 5 mana enchantment that doesn't do anything, either the aggro deck's just going to blatantly ignore it, or the reactive decks are going to immediately counter it and go, cool, now I get to do what I want to do.
Yeah, another small thing as well is that the cards that see play that don't immediately impact the board often do 2 things. They often set up for an extremely powerful turn, often in combo decks. So, for an example, the recently pointed Wishclaw Talisman in Storm. Often you'd see them play it on turn 2, and that would be their turn. But then that means that the following turn or the turn after, soon they have a 1 mana tutor that means that the game's probably not going to go on for too much longer. And cards like Sylvan Library and also Search for Azcanta is another example. You are getting something out of them every turn. They are doing their thing every turn. Whereas a card like Doubling Season, or a card near and dear to my heart, but a card that unfortunately isn't particularly playable in the format, Metallurgic Summonings, you won't necessarily get value out of it every single turn. So you need to make sure that whatever mana you're putting in, preferably as little as possible, but it doesn't actively have to be as little as possible. You can play more costly do-nothings, as they're called, but you need to make sure that if you are playing a card like that, you are getting value from them pretty much every turn, or that they are going to make you win the game significantly quicker or easier. A card like Doubling Season can feel that way at times, sometimes allowing you to instantly, play a Planeswalker and immediately emblem it or whatnot, but you can't guarantee that that's going to happen, or that you're going to even be alive when you've spent that much mana on a card that inconsistent. Speaking of consistency in Canlander, Aaron, do you want to talk about a couple of ways that decks in a 100-card singleton format increase their consistency and make sure that the game goes as planned?
Yeah, one of the key things we can use to help consistency in Canadian Highlander is to use redundancy as a tool, where we're going to be obviously including powerful cards, but as it's a singleton format, we sometimes have to include cards that do a similar effect, but maybe not as efficiently. For example, in our burn deck, we are 100% going to be running Lightning Bolt. It's one of the most powerful burn spells ever printed. But as this is a singleton, we can only run the 1 copy, so we're also going to be running cards like Chain Lightning, which are quite good, and a range of burn spells all the way down to Shock, which is not great, but at the end of the day, if your opponent's on 2 and you point Shock at their face, there's a good chance you're going to win. Similarly, this can be seen in mana dorks, where you have the high-end mana dorks, as we like to refer to them as things like Noble Hierarch and Birds of Paradise. But in a ramp strategy, you're going to want a plethora of them, and even will sometimes include cards like Boreal Druid or Elves of Deep Shadow. And again, this appears in cantrips, where you've got the big 3 in Preordain, Ponder, and Brainstorm, but can even flex all the way down to playing cards like Peak, for example. This isn't necessarily to say that you have to include these kinds of cards. Burn's obviously going to use redundancy here, but if you're playing like Jeskai midrange, for example, you're going to be playing Lightning Bolt and maybe Chain Lightning, but you're not going to be playing things like Shock or Flame Jab. Some decks are just going to want the upper echelon. It's important to remember to stick to your game plan, to not dilute the way that you are going to win the game. It's just in some decks you are going to want to be playing multiple copies of the same card. Speaking of which, Wilko, talk to us about tutors.
Very often in decks, especially in a singleton format, you will have cards that are either irreplaceable or just don't really have any real alternatives. Or you may have a game plan based around finding very specific cards. And that is where tutors come in and become very relevant. Tutors can mean all sorts of things. The most common tutors in the format are by far the fetch lands. Yes, I consider them tutors. And they obviously allow you to have a consistent mana base game after game after game, get all the colors you need, get the mana you need to cast your spells. More specific tutors, however, the tutors that we're really talking about here, your demonic tutors, your mystical tutors and such, they will often show up for specific cards in mind. Even though DT can go and get any card, you are unlikely in, say, blue-black control. It's unlikely that you're going to be demonic tutoring for an opt, as we mentioned earlier. It's much more likely that you are going to be tutoring for a Jace the Mind Sculptor or something like that, a WinCon or a board wipe or something like that. It allows you to essentially play multiple copies of the same card without having to fall back on less powerful, redundant copies of the card. It also allows you in decks like Combo that we mentioned or in Control to find your specific win cons. Whether it's Mystical Tutor putting Entreat the Angels on top of your library in blue-white Control, or it's the previously mentioned Wishclaw Talisman searching up Tendrils of Agony in Storm, whether it's Tezzeret the Seeker searching up a Time Vault and Time Vault combo. Tutors, although often expensive when it comes to your points, allow you to just do extremely powerful things. For more on that, you can look at episode 2, where we talked about the points list in depth and talked about tutors. I don't really want to repeat myself there. Like, everyone knows what tutors do. Everyone knows how powerful they can be. But it is a tool that the format gives you plenty of powerful examples of to use if you have the points or the cards that you want to look for. And it's a very good way to improve the consistency of your deck and make sure that your deck is doing what it's meant to be doing game after game after game.
Yeah, you mentioned there about treating fetch lands as tutors. Obviously, in a singleton format, your mana bases are going to be incredibly important. So, when you're building a mana base for a Canadian Highlander deck, what are the kind of things you're looking for?
Well, first and almost certainly most importantly, it's good to know what sort of numbers you're looking for. For aggressive strategies and stuff, you're probably looking at around 30 to 32, because you want to make sure that you obviously have mana in the early game so that you can, cast these threats and stuff like that. But you don't want to be drawing land after land after land when you want to be drawing, threats and killing your opponent. Lands, for the most part, don't kill your opponent. When you start wanting the game to go longer, you will obviously want more lands. So mid-range decks often play about 34 to 36 and control 38 to 40. Because in mid-range, you will have more expensive threats that will require more mana and often mana sink. So for instance, in green-white mid-range decks, you might have Gavany Township and man lands. Whereas in control, you're just wanting to hit your land drop every turn so you can get the mana advantage. Play your powerful spells as well as, any X spells you have, like Entreat the Angels that I mentioned, Sphinx's Revelation, counter spells like Condescend. In control, you just want to make sure that you have a constant mana advantage so that you can cast your spells, do things, respond multiple times in the same turn, etc. When looking at lands for mana base as well, I think it's quite important to mention that 0 mana artifacts, maybe don't count them as a whole land, but do bear in mind that they are there. If you are playing mid-range, for example, and you play, say, a spread with 3 Moxen and Time Twist, then you can probably move more towards that 34 land count rather than 36, because you have 3 Moxen in your deck that can essentially count as lands. One-off cards like Black Lotus or Mana Vault, I wouldn't count, especially if they cost mana, like don't start counting Sol Ring or stuff like that as a land. As powerful as it is, it does still cost a mana. Just make sure that, again, it constantly comes back to the idea of diluting your game plan. Don't add too many lands into aggro, otherwise you'll draw them rather than the threats you need. Don't play too few lands in control, otherwise you won't be able to keep up with the threats that your opponent's dishing out or be able to cast your higher end spells. Just make sure that you have a good balance of being able to do the stuff that you want to do while letting your deck do what it is meant to do. And a good example of this can be seen in what lands you actually want to play. In aggro, for example, you get some utility lands like your Ramanap Ruins, Barbarian Ring, things like that. Mishra's Workshop and Mutavault often show up quite a lot. Mishra's Factory, even. In mid-range, you can start getting in more expensive man lands and stuff. Your Shambling Vents, maybe even Celestial Colonnade if you're feeling so inclined. That might be a little bit much, but the sort of the cheaper ones. Treetop Village is a fine example. And then you can also start looking at more utility lands like Gavany Township that I mentioned, or the Castle Cycle that was printed recently. And then similarly in Control, you want to make sure that you have a good amount of lands that can maybe do other things. So manlands are a great example. Castle Vantress is a godsend for Control decks. But you also want to make sure that, and this goes across all three of the sort of archetypes I've mentioned, you want to try and make it that your lands enter untapped as much as possible. Man lands don't, for example, but the payoff is worth it. But you don't want to be playing temples in this format, really, because often they will slow you down more than the scry is worth it, and such like that. You don't want to be playing too many colorless lands. Wasteland and Strip Mine are very popular. Volrath Stronghold in, say, a black mid-range deck might be quite good, but you don't want to overload too much because, again, then you'll get into those problems with being able to cast your cards, not the amount of mana, but the color of mana. You can get color screwed very easily. That's not to say that every mana base has to be fetches, manlands, shocks, duels, all these sort of things. Canadian Highlander, although it is a format with the Power 9 and Force of Wills and Snapcasters and duels, as we mentioned, and all these lovely, powerful cards. It is a format that you can play on a, admittedly not the cheapest, but fairly reasonable budget. Aaron, do you want to quickly talk about a few of the sort of like budget options that the format has and sort of ways that you can maybe make your budget spread a little bit further?
Yeah, if you're taking budget into consideration for when you're building a Canadian Highlander deck, it's probably worth considering the types of decks you already enjoy playing. If you have a Goblins EDH deck, for example, there is a good chance that you have a large number of Goblins that are going to slot into a Goblins build in a Canadian Highlander deck. Similarly, if you are a Burn player in Pauper or Modern or Legacy, you're going to own a large number of higher-end Burn spells. If you are like a Modern player, there is a chance that you will own cards like Snapcaster Mage or just a Mind Sculptor, so a mid-range or a control strategy might be something that you can lean in towards. On the flip side of this, if you know that you're a Modern player or a Legacy player, then making those kind of investments in those cards is something that you can be a little bit more comfortable with. And one of the really nice aspects of Canadian Highlander is that when you invest money into higher end cards is knowing that no card is going to get banned in Canadian Highlander, so you will always be able to play with the cards that you want to play with. So that kind of fear of going, I don't know if I want to sink like $100 or $200 into a card because what if it gets banned next week, is already alleviated. You can still play with it if it's a card that you thoroughly enjoy.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to be a Legacy player for a good few years now, but it wasn't actually until playing Canadian Highlander that I actually started picking up dual lands, and I now own one of each of the dual lands, which I can now play in Commander, in Canadian Highlander, in Legacy. And although it has been an investment picking up those cards, it doesn't feel nearly as bad as it could have done if I just played Commander or just played Canadian Highlander. The fact that it opens up options in other formats, other decks, it just alleviated some of that pressure of, oh God, is this a worthwhile investment? Similarly, already being a player of Legacy and stuff like that, I already had a Chase the Mind Sculptor, I already had a Snapcaster Mage, I already had a Force of Will. So that made it very easy for me to build Sultai Control. Similarly, as you said, if you have tribal decks of the shining example, Commander decks in general, there will certainly be some cards that have plenty of crossover. You know, cards like, just off the top of my head, for my Marif Will of the Wilds Naya deck, that deck plays cards like Rex Sage, Scavenging Ooze, Knight of Autumn, Green Sun Zenith. These are all like really good green mid-range cards. Not all the cards in it are going to be good. It plays cards like Doubling Season, for example, like we talked about earlier. But there are definitely Commander decks out there that, with not all that many changes, can be made into a decent Canlander deck. And like I say, especially tribal decks. If you have an elf deck, you can build Hoof quite easily. If you have a goblins deck, there is a goblins deck in Canadian Highlander. Vampires, Merfolk, these are all decks that may not be like the best in Canlander, but are certainly playable, and you may very well have plenty of cards for already. Burn is pretty cheap to build, and then again, it allows you to play Burn in other formats. There are red-based tempo decks like Is It Tempo or even Jeskai Tempo that are fairly cheap to build. There are options out there. And depending on what formats you play, what decks you have, it could be easier than you think it is. You probably have a good chunk of a Canadian Highlander deck already around you, maybe in several pieces, maybe in one big 100-card chunk already. It's very easy to get into this format if you know where to look and know what you want to be playing.
Yeah, so I think that'll just about wrap us up for episode 3. So that's going to bring us to our closing segment of Card Spotlight. So, Wilko, what card from Commander 2017 have you got to talk to us about today?
So we just talked about how there are certain decks that may exist that you can sort of convert over. And although I'm not saying that the entire deck could be converted over, this is definitely a commander itself that is near and dear to my heart and is popular in the Canadian Highlander format, although in some very specific decks. I would like to talk today about Kess Dissident Mage. Kess Dissident Mage is 1 blue, black, red for a legendary human wizard with flying. During each of your turns, you may cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. If a card cast this way would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead, and she is a 3/4. So, as you've probably already guessed, Kess goes in basically one color combination of deck, and that's Grixis. And oh boy, should she be in basically every Grixis deck. She is such an incredibly powerful card. First of all, 4 mana for a 3/4 flyer. That's not a bad rate. Not exceptional, but definitely not a bad rate. But then you add this repeatable, almost Snapcaster-like effect. You can't use her on counter spells unless your opponent does something in your turn and you haven't used Kess already. But the ability to flash back a cantrip, a tutor, get a cost reduction on the flashback of a card like maybe Faithless Looting, a removal spell. The way she's worded even allows you to cast cards for alternate costs. So if your opponent, say, does do something that needs, say, a Force of Will, you can exile a blue card from your hand and cast it that way. She's just a fantastic all-around great card that is a sort of a budget Snapcaster, alternate Snapcaster, but obviously she's just best alongside that card. And yeah, I think in Grixis Control, she is obviously a shoo-in. But even in decks like Grixis Midrange, I think she's perfectly fine because, again, she gets to flash back those like cantrips to smooth out your draws or removal spells so you can get your creatures through. So if you are playing Grixis, I wholly recommend playing Kess. She is a wonderful, wonderful card and has served me well in many years since she was printed in Canadian Highlander and 1v1 Commander and regular Commander. I love her to pieces. Aaron, do you have anything to say about our Lord and Saviour Kess?
If there's one thing I love, if it's not casting 1 lightning bolt, it's casting 2. Being able to repeat the spells is exceptional. And I know we had a conversation about this the other day, and you're definitely going to have to enlighten me, but I believe she's got some interesting way that she works with adventure spells.
Yes, I wasn't going to bring this up, but one of the things that I've loved recently, I have had for a while, a 1v1 Kess commander deck, and I love it to pieces. And they printed Brazen Borrower and Bonecrusher Giant and Murderous Rider. And with Kess, even though in every zone apart from the stack, they are creatures, Kess checks whether the card you have cast is a legal action once it's already on the stack. So Kess can, in fact, cast the adventure part of Adventure Creatures. You can have a Brazen Borrower in the bin, cast Petty Theft with Kess. Kess will then check and see that you are, in fact, yes, casting a instant called Petty Theft with her. And then the card will go into exile on an adventure. It's a really silly but beautifully unfortunate, I guess, interaction. Fortunate for you, unfortunate for your opponent. But it's just a wonderful interaction that I was so happy when I found out that's how that worked.
Yeah, and I think that'll wrap it up for episode 3 of Seasons Cast. If you want to follow us on social medias, Wilko, where can they find you on Twitter?
You can find me at Force of Wilko. Aaron, where can they find you?
You can find me at The Mighty Shaka.
And of course, we'd be remiss not to thank IQ Games for supporting this podcast. Even the patrons of the shop have just been really, really just great for backing the podcast. So thank you to everyone, whether we know you in person, know you from the internet, or don't know you at all. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in episode 4.
There is a cooing guinea pig here.
Oh.
Right, 1 second. I shall return him.